Welcome to the Inside Elections podcast, where we analyze elections in a nonpartisan, data-driven, and accessible way. In this episode, we'll take a fresh look at the states where redistricting is ongoing and could impact the fight for the House, and we'll delve into what redistricting reforms could help Congress and the country. And we'll do it with special guest Dave Wasserman of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter. Buckle up. I'm Nathan Gonzales, editor and publisher of Inside Elections, the go-to place for nonpartisan analysis for more than 40 years. I spent the weekend at Rocky Acre Bed and Breakfast in Lancaster County, which is located in Pennsylvania's 11th district, represented by Republican Lloyd Smucker.
Love that guy's jams. I'm Jacob Rubashkin, deputy editor of Inside Elections. And this past weekend, I forded the mighty Potomac River to journey all the way to Virginia's 8th Congressional District, which is represented by Don Beyer.
Are you trying to outdo me on the dad jokes? That's my role in this on this podcast, but that's all right. I guess I can leave room and space. So I was disappointed though when we always go to Lancaster County, and I wanted to every year, and I wanted to go to see the Lancaster Stormers, which is an independent baseball team. But there was a big thunderstorm, and so I'm glad that we didn't. It would have been a very rainy, probably fourth inning. But maybe next time.
Yeah, and all jokes aside, Lloyd Smucker is interesting because I'm not sure how many members of Congress were born Amish, but Lloyd Smucker was born into an Amish family. They left that community when he was young, but a pretty uncommon upbringing, at least in this day and age, for the congressman from Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and it took me.
I don't think he's related to the jam. I don't think he's related to the jam Smuckers, but who knows?
There's a lot of people Googling right now. And I didn't realize until my adult years when I met my now wife, who's from Indiana, that the difference between Amish who live in Pennsylvania, Amish who live in Indiana, like there are some distinctions there. In particular, sometimes what the wagon looks like and where the wagon is covered, and
wow. So
there's a lot there, and a lot that people probably didn't know that they were going to get on this podcast as they tuned in. But let's move on. Before we get into our redistricting talk, what are some recent headlines in congressional races, Jacob?
In Georgia, Governor Brian Kemp will not run for the Senate next year against Democrat Jon Ossoff, depriving the Republican Party of their best possible recruit against the freshman senator. Kemp had frozen the Republican field while he made his decision, but now that he's out of the running, any number of people could jump in, including potentially Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Democrats are hoping. Democratic Congressman Jerry Connolly announced that his cancer has returned and that he won't seek re-election in the 11th District of Virginia. Considering Harris finished ahead of Trump by 34 points in this Northern Virginia seat outside of Washington, D.C., a crowded Democratic field is expected. Last cycle, when the neighboring 10th District was open, 12 Democrats faced off in the primary. It looks like we might be headed for something similar.
Moving up the East Coast, former Maine Governor Paul LePage is running for that state's 2nd congressional district, currently held by Democrat Jared Golden. LePage served 2 terms as governor in the 2010s, winning both of his races by pluralities thanks to a third-party candidate being on the ballot. He unsuccessfully ran for a 3rd non-consecutive term in 2022. He lost statewide by 13 points, but in the 2nd district specifically, he did win by about 2 points, 50 to 48%.
And one of the big unanswered questions is whether Golden seeks re-election here or not. He probably isn't going to run for the Senate against his former boss, Susan Collins, but he could still run for governor, which would change the dynamic of this congressional race. And finally, Hannah Trudeau, a former reporter for the Hill newspaper, announced she's exploring a run in New Hampshire's first district, where Democrat Chris Pappas is not seeking re-election because of his Senate run. Trudeau would run as a Democrat, but the open seat will likely attract a lot of attention from candidates from both parties.
Yeah, and Maura Sullivan, who's a Marine veteran who ran for that seat in 2018, came in second to Pappas in the primary, is already in the race this time around, and probably is the candidate to beat if Hannah Trudeau or anyone else gets involved in that race this cycle. I want to welcome our special guest on today's show, Dave Wasserman of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter. Now, Dave has been at the Cook Report for 18 years after first making a name for himself at Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia. You've probably seen him on MSNBC, on NBC News, and on Twitter or X, where his handle is at Redistrict. His tagline is "I've seen enough," and his follower count is almost enough to fill a congressional district all by itself, about 609,000 followers at last checking. Dave, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, but I have to caveat that I think 500,000 of those are my mom, so it's an honor. Thank you, guys.
Well, we're so glad to have you here. We're going to cover a lot of ground today. But before we jump into our main topics, you know the drill. You got to tell us, what congressional district did you grow up in?
So I grew up in New Jersey's 12th congressional district, and actually my home district was a big reason why I got interested in House races in the first place, because in 1998, when I was 13, 14 years old, there was a really kind of dark horse race going on in the district between Republican incumbent Mike Pappas and a Princeton plasma physicist, a Democrat named Rush Holt. And some of you listeners may recall that this was during the Clinton impeachment, and Pappas had gone to the floor of the House to sing a ditty about Kenneth Starr. It went along the lines of "Twinkle, twinkle, Kenneth Starr, now we know how great you are." And this was a historically kind of moderate Republican district, a lot of country clubs, a lot of horses in Hunterdon County, and yet, Princeton, the Princeton area was just kind of beginning to flex its political and cultural muscle, and there was a big reaction, a revolt against the Republicans' drive to impeach Clinton, and Holt capitalized on that clip, that C-SPAN clip of Pappas, and won that race in a big upset. I remember election night '98 when at first it looked like Holt was going to fall short, but the results from Mercer County, the bluest part of the district, had been transposed, and he ended up winning. And then people started wearing shirts around the district that said, "My congressman is a rocket scientist," and he went on to serve a number of terms. So that really sparked my interest. I think the Cook Political Report had that in likely R or maybe lean R, so it was a genuine upset.
Well, and I always love it when you share your story, because in 1998, I'm a few years older than you are. I may or may not have been in college. I'm not even sure I still knew what a congressional district was. And so, and the point of that is that there are multiple paths to getting to kind of get to do what we all do, right? Like, you can, maybe some people are sort of political junkies growing up, maybe more like me, where I became more politically interested later as an early adult. But I love that there are different paths to
Oh
get to one
yeah,
place.
and when I was a high school student, I remember writing in to Stu Rothenberg. I wrote a few people whose work I admired, and he was kind enough to respond and encouraged me to continue studying history. And I'll never forget that. And so it was kind of cool ultimately to get to meet some of my idols, Charlie Cook, Stu Rothenberg, Amy Walter, because back then I never thought that I'd get a chance to even meet them, let alone work alongside them. I should note that New Jersey 12 took on a number of shapes over the years. My hometown, Montgomery Township, just north of Princeton, made its way into the 7th congressional district, which had a couple of close races in the last decade. But in the most recent redistricting, was put back into the 12th.
Which is a great segue into talking about redistricting this cycle and what I don't know, a mess or a beautiful mess it can be. But let's jump in. Redistricting is one of the most important and most complicated parts of our electoral process. In 2011, ProPublica wrote a song to try to bring some clarity to the process.
Representative democracy in USA, we elect legislators, that's how laws are made. 435 reps in Congress means 435 districts among us. But how do we decide who represents who? We draw lines on a map, that's what we do. District population should be roughly the same, so every vote counts in the very same way. Keep communities together so every voice is heard. Since populations move, shift, shrink, and expand, we get some data every census, then we draw them again. So politicians are accountable to every last woman and man.
That song is great, Nathan. I appreciate you sharing it, but there's another song that I have in mind that I like a little bit better about redistricting. I think we should take a listen to that as well.
Yo, you think it's gerrymandering, son? It barely makes a dent. Those bogus maps are traps, but count for 17%. A whopping 83% is just Americans self-sorting. Dems got trapped because they clumped in cities and read their own reporting. Hill crushed it by 6 mil at NYC and West LA. She lost Michigan, Wisconsin, and PA by 80K. So you can sit here and cry over flyover states, or you can boo-hoo like snowflakes and live tweet debates. Your echo chamber loves it when you preach your truth. But don't talk to me until you buy a house in Duluth. If 2% of women's marches only moved Midwest, Trump would still be judging beauty pageants east of Budapest.
I didn't know that footage existed.
Perfect. Tell us about that event.
So a long time ago, I had a friend who wrote Broadway musicals, and there was some kind of charity event that he asked me to come perform at, and I was just befuddled at what I could contribute among these Broadway stars. But the one thing I did prior to that rap, I suppose, was I did break out the fiddle, which I think, Nathan, your first selection needs a little bit of a fiddle on that track.
There you go. Well, that's it wasn't just a Twitter handle. You could tweet about redistricting, you can rap about redistricting. I don't know what else there is. So we're glad you're here. So even though the bulk of redistricting takes place in the 2 years after the census, there's a handful of states where we could see a mid-decade redraw. Let's start with the state of Ohio. State law requires that Ohio redraw its congressional map ahead of the 2026 elections because the current maps were passed without a bipartisan majority in the state legislature. It looks like the state legislature has until November 30th to draw a new map. Dave and Jacob, but Dave, what do we think is going to be the results of this latest iteration of the Ohio map?
Yeah, and you guys have done some great reporting on this. It's amazing. I when I first started my Twitter account, I started at Redistrict thinking that it would just be a temporary thing to cover the 2010, 2011 redistricting cycle. And then what I realized is that we would be in a permanent state of redistricting. So I just decided to keep the handle. And now we're about halfway between censuses, and it's still raging in a number of states. And Ohio is a place where the reformers thought they had it made when they were able to pass a constitutional amendment, but there were also a number of loopholes that Republicans have been able to take advantage of, and now they have a more favorable state Supreme Court. In fact, in the most recent elections, we saw those reformers go back to the ballot and try and pass another redistricting reform to strengthen the original one that was supported by the former state Supreme Court Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor. But now that that Republicans have a majority not only legislatively, not only on the Redistricting Commission, which takes control if the legislature doesn't pass a new map, then but also on the state Supreme Court, it's very possible that Republicans could dismantle or at least alter the 13th and 9th congressional districts to target 2 Democratic seats. I think it could be harder for them to target the 1st district in Cincinnati because there is a provision in the state constitutional amendment that Cincinnati is one of the cities that has to be kept whole. And so if it were to be appended to, let's say, Dave Taylor's 2nd district and moved out of the 1st, that would potentially make the 2nd district, which is now an overwhelmingly red seat, a little bit dicier for Republicans to hold. So, I think Marcy Kaptur in the 9th district and Amelia Sykes in the 13th district will be in tougher seats. And the fact that a map that's passed without bipartisan support is only valid for 4 years is hardly a penalty for Republicans. In fact, what it's done is it's created an opportunity for the majority party there to go back and redraw in the middle of the decade in a way that might be more advantageous.
No, in retrospect, it really does seem like that 2018 measure was misguided, or at least created a whole set of poor incentives for real redistricting reform between the 2-cycle trigger, which, like you said, allows an aggressive state legislature essentially to fine tune a gerrymander every 4 years. Normally, you get one bite at the apple, and if political trends change over the course of the decade, you could get stuck with a map that no longer is advantageous. I mean, we saw that play out in Texas last decade, where the gerrymander they drew in 2011 by 2018 turned into a potential bloodbath for Republicans. But in this case, failure to do something bipartisan allows the majority party to fine tune a gerrymander. But also the redistricting commission that they created, right? And we'll get into this, I'm sure, Dave, is composed of statewide elected officials primarily. All of whom are Republican now, but at the time that the idea was conceived, there was still a notion that Ohio could elect Democrats statewide, which is not really the case anymore. So because the Secretary of State and the governor and both houses of the legislature and everything is Republican controlled, this backup commission that they had envisioned as being kind of a stopgap against an aggressive legislature actually doesn't serve any different purpose. The dynamics seem kind of fundamentally unchanged from the state legislature itself.
That's true. And the other thing Republicans in Ohio did, they were successful in adding party labels to state Supreme Court races, which makes it much more difficult for Democrats to get their preferred candidates elected to that top court. And as a result, the criteria or the constraints in the constitutional amendment are open to court interpretation. The criteria say that a map can't unduly favor or disfavor one party. Well, as we've seen time and time again, that's in the eye of the beholder. And right now, Ohio has 10 Republicans, 5 Democrats. It's very possible we could see a 12-3 map for 2026 and 2028 if Republicans succeed in adding just a handful more Republican counties to the 13th and 9th districts.
And that has a big impact on the overall fight for the House, where Democrats only need a net gain of 3 seats. Tack on 2, if Republicans are able to squeeze 2 more out of Ohio, then you're at +5, which still is not a large number, but that's almost double double the margin that Democrats needed without any sort of Ohio redraw. Dave, you mentioned the change in the adding partisanship to Supreme Court races in Wisconsin, which is still technically the Supreme Court races are nonpartisan, but everyone knows who is being backed by Republicans and Democrats. But Susan Crawford winning earlier this year has an impact, potential impact on redistricting. That opens the door for new litigation challenging the current congressional map. Democrats successfully challenged the Republican state legislative gerrymander in 2023, but a recusal by one of the 4 Democratic justices last year prevented the court from hearing a similar case on the congressional map. All of this was covered by Jacob's story a few weeks ago in Inside Elections. But what do we think is going to happen with the Wisconsin map and the net result of any changes?
Yeah, well, you have to assume that Wisconsin is going to revisit this congressional map. The question is, what is the mechanism by which they alter the lines? Now, the current lines have produced a 6-2 Republican advantage in the delegation. One of those seats, the 3rd district, is highly competitive, held by Derek Van Orden in western Wisconsin. One of those seats is kind of on the margins, on the outer edges of what could be considered competitive. The 1st district, south of Milwaukee, held by Brian Stile. And the recusal by Janet Protasiewicz the other year, she had explicitly campaigned on revisiting or overturning the congressional district lines, even though this was a compromise map that Governor Tony Evers, a Democrat, had been part of crafting. So the question for 2026 is, would the court or a court-appointed map drawer go so far as to split Milwaukee or Madison into multiple districts to get Democrats closer to parity in the delegation? That would seem to go against traditional compactness criteria or standards. Yet that's probably what it takes to correct for Democrats' kind of natural geographic disadvantage in the state, given that their voters are so concentrated in those 2 cities.
And Utah, I want to keep us moving. Utah, let's see. Democrats are hopeful that ongoing litigation will ultimately result in a new congressional map and a winnable seat in the Salt Lake City area, even though Utah overall is a red state. I guess, Jacob, bring us up to speed on the situation in Utah.
We're waiting. We were all waiting on a state district judge in Utah to issue her decision. This is the latest in a long string of developments. Utah also passed a redistricting reform measure in 2018 that created an independent redistricting commission that had very specific criteria, including partisan non-bias that it had to take into account in drawing a map. But what ended up happening was the Republican-controlled state legislature essentially overturned the citizen ballot initiative and made that commission advisory, passed their own map that was a pretty severe gerrymander, dismantled the Salt Lake City district that had existed for the previous decade and had been held by a Democrat for most of the last 2 decades, and created 4 Republican districts. So a bunch of people sued. It made its way up to the state Supreme Court, which said the legislature can't invalidate a citizen initiative, such as the redistricting one. They bounced it back down to the district court, which now has to decide the ultimate question, which is this map that has been in place for the last 2 cycles legal, or does it have to be redrawn? And, if so, what does the remedial map look like? I talked to a number of people associated with the plaintiff side who were very optimistic that they would get a favorable ruling and that there would be new maps in place before next year that would have a winnable district anchored in Salt Lake City and the larger Salt Lake County area. But we just don't know yet because the court hasn't rendered its final decision.
And I've been doing this long enough where I feel like the redistricting process, whether it's the redrawing or the litigation, it always takes a lot longer than we expect, right? It gets drawn out and drawn out. So my question to both of you, we talked about Ohio, Wisconsin, and Utah. There's also potential changes in Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, Georgia. Let's put Ohio to the side because it seems like they're going to have some new map. With the rest of the batch of states, where do you think we will have new maps for the 2026 elections and that have an impact on the fight for the majority?
I think Wisconsin and Utah are the next most likely, in my estimation. Although, if a Supreme Court decision revisiting Alabama and Louisiana favors the Republicans when it comes out this summer, then that would catapult those states ahead in line. But I think Jacob's right. The district judge does seem open to tossing Utah's map and paving the way for a Salt Lake County district, but it could be, such a ruling would almost be guaranteed to be appealed back to the state Supreme Court. But the question in the Deep South right now is, are we going to see a repeat of what happened in the late 80s and early 90s, back when there was a decision, Thornburg v. Jingles, that hastened the creation of a lot of Black majority districts in the Deep South, including a number that had rather unusual shapes. Some of them seemed to defy contiguity, like Michael Jordan defied gravity. And then the Supreme Court in the mid-90s said, you know what, this is too grotesque, and these districts do meet the definition of obscenity. And in Shaw v. Reno and a number of other cases, they kind of reined it in, and we ended up with something in between. Now, Democrats are enjoying the fruit of Allen v. Milligan, which created one additional Black majority seat in Alabama, one in Louisiana. And yet these districts have unusual shapes. Republicans are suing and have taken this back to the Supreme Court to argue that they constitute a racial gerrymander. And so if the Supreme Court reins in those shapes, the question then becomes, do remedial maps keep in place an opportunity for Black residents in those areas to elect candidates of choice, or with more normal lines, or do we go back to the previous regime where effectively Black voters only had the opportunity to elect a candidate of choice in one district in each of those states? So there's kind of a swing of +2 for Republicans that could happen, or we could preserve the status quo.
No, I second everything Dave said. I think I would go with Utah as the place where we're most likely to get a new map. I think the Supreme Court, given that the Supreme Court just handed down that Merrill v. Milligan, Allen v. the Milligan case in Alabama 2 years ago, essentially, the notion that they would now go back and essentially reverse themselves, if not in totality, like Alito wants them to do, in for all intents and purposes, reverse what they put in motion just a couple years ago. I would be surprised by that. Though maybe I shouldn't be surprised by anything that comes out of the Supreme Court. But I think that we're at least a couple cycles away from that backlash happening in the Deep South. But Utah, I mean, everything is in place. Everything has been, except for kind of whatever appeal is generated from this decision, we're about one appeal away from real finality in Utah. So I would anticipate that one ahead of all these other states as the most likely to have a new map. But Dave, I'm very curious. We all cover redistricting a lot in our line of work. You have carved out a specific niche for yourself over the last 15 years on this front. I want to know, when I call up sources and ask them about redistricting, sometimes they'll ask what I think, but mostly it's like me asking them questions. When you call up sources on redistricting, people at the state legislative level, people, who are involved in the actual process, are they asking you for your thoughts? Are they saying, well, what do you think we should do with this town or this community? Or if you drew the map, where would you put this part of the state versus that part of the state?
Well, I can't say that's happened, and it wouldn't be my place to give them advice on how to draw the lines. One thing that I've done in my role is I've I've kind of mocked up different scenarios for how each party could maximize its advantage as a preview of what we might expect, because this isn't exactly, a dark art where advances in technology have allowed for parties to exert their gains. It simply comes down to packing and cracking, and that has been happening since, for decades. What's changed is that Americans are more sorted into like-minded precincts and counties and states than they used to be, and that has it has increased the power of redistricting because it's easier to gerrymander voters when they've already kind of separated themselves into 75-25 precincts. And that's what I think the biggest misconception about redistricting is. It's not that we have crazy algorithms or software that's allowed map makers to press their advantage to new levels. It's kind of the voters.
And that's a good segue to a broader discussion about redistricting, because last year you were named as an Andrew Carnegie Fellow with your winning proposal was a roadmap to the middle ground, restoring competitiveness in congressional elections. Well, first of all, congratulations. I would never even, you were among what, 28 other scholars, I think, that were granted fellowships with this class. But how do you even start tackling such a huge subject like this, and what's your goal with this study with the fellowship?
Well, to be honest, I'm still open to ideas, but I I typed up a 5-page proposal while our son was in the cardiac ICU in summer of 2023, recovering from surgery after he was born, and now he's thriving, thankfully. But my goal in this project is to focus on the notion of competitiveness as a redistricting criteria. And it seems obvious, but actually only 2 states out of 50 list competitiveness as a criteria in drawing new maps. And it would seem as if giving voters a genuine choice in November would or should be relevant to how maps are drawn. By the way, those states are Arizona and Colorado. And look, I know that everyone has their own idea of how to fix gerrymandering. Is it the efficiency gap? Is it farming it out to algorithms? I think part of the challenge in redistricting reform has been that the reformers can't all agree on what the best approach is. And I was on a panel in Maine last summer where it was at this kind of Future of Democracy conference, and one of the other speakers there was retired Justice Stephen Breyer, who, by the way, I didn't know this until recently, but if you're a retired Supreme Court justice, apparently you can decide to sit in as a judge on on state and local trials, and so he's doing that in Maine. And we were at this small dinner, and there were a few glasses of wine, and I finally built up the courage to approach Justice Breyer, and I asked, I'm going to be leading this panel on fixing gerrymandering tomorrow. Do you have any suggestions? And his reply was something along the lines of, "Well, I hope you guys can figure it out because we certainly couldn't." And
oh my goodness, I don't know if that's funny or alarming or all of the above.
Well, it's true. The Supreme Court really has struggled.
Yeah. Well, and we got a firsthand look into that Colorado piece because during a few years ago, we were, I would say, the kind of the data vendor there was a bipartisan group that got a redistricting commission created. And then that bipartisan group tried to come together to try to implement what they had all decided on. And on one level, everyone agreed, but as you got into those details, particularly on competitiveness, it got messier. right? And it
Right.
wasn't, is it 55-45? Okay, great. Well, what races are included in that? Is it past presidential, past two presidentials? Is it all statewide? I mean, at some point you have to get into that level of detail, and it got to be more difficult to get consensus.
That's right. And how do you define competitiveness? I know we each have our metrics. The Cook Report has the PVI. You guys have your baseline, but I think these could be valuable in assessing, kind of where the 45-yard lines are, so to speak, when it comes to whether a district is genuinely up for grabs in November. And also, we have had a number of successful state level reforms that have established commissions to, reduce the legislature's role in the process. But another key point here: not all commissions are created equal. And even though we have 10 states that employ bipartisan commissions for congressional redistricting, some of them are more an extension of party leaders in the state legislature, and their members come with marching orders from their respective corners. Some of them are more citizen driven. I would put California, Michigan, Colorado into that bucket. And one of the reasons why Democrats are in such close contention for the House majority is that they got favorable maps out of some of these commission drawn states: California, Michigan, New Jersey. Arguably, the only state where Republicans got a better map from a commission was Arizona, which had been favorable to Democrats in the previous decade, but both the second district and sixth districts were made a little bit redder, and Republicans now hold them. So it's fascinating to watch how these criteria vary from state to state, and how the culture can vary.
And Dave, do you think that there is a state that has figured it out, that is doing the right thing when it comes to redistricting? If Stephen Breyer says the Supreme Court couldn't figure out the gerrymandering question, is there a state or a citizen-led initiative that has done a good job that you think could serve as a model for something on a more nationwide basis?
So even though there's no such thing as a perfect redistricting process or a commission, I do think some of the more citizen-driven ones, whether it's Colorado, Michigan, California, they have done better, I would say, at removing politics or limiting the role of partisanship in the process relative to some of the more political commissions out there. An example would be New Jersey. One thing that every process needs, though, is some kind of tie-breaking mechanism, because we saw in both New York and Virginia this past go-around, there were equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans on a commission, and the result was pretty predictable: deadlock and stalemate. And so in Colorado and California, where you have 4 or 5 unaffiliated voters or independents on a commission, that forces the parties to the negotiating table. I think Colorado's map was probably the most even-handed, in that it created a new district, the 8th district, which is close as can be, and looks like it could end up in the toss-up column for the rest of the decade.
And which way, nationwide, it seems like over the last 2 decades, there's been a push toward more independent redistricting commissions. Do you feel like that momentum has sustained itself, or is the pendulum swinging back? What's next? What's the next frontier in terms of redistricting, developments that you can already kind of see in the currents as we look toward 2030?
Well, I do think the momentum towards reform and commissions has plateaued a bit, because most of the states that have embraced, not all, but most, are Democratic leaning states where, the bulk of the reform movement was on the left. And it's harder to persuade voters in redder leaning states, or at least it has been if you look at the track record of ballot initiatives, to embrace reforms that would effectively limit the majority party's power. Now, one interesting dynamic is in the past decade, it was pretty much Democrats who were complaining about gerrymandering because, after all, Republicans were winning a higher share of seats than votes in the House. I'd consider, 10 years ago to be kind of the apex of Republicans' gerrymandering advantage. But after the 2024 election, something changed in my mentions. I noticed that the majority of the complaining I was hearing about gerrymandering was from the right. And in fact, in 2024, Democrats won a very slightly higher share of seats in the House than their share of votes. And I heard a number of more conservative followers bemoaning maps in Illinois, California, even though it's debatable whether Democrats successfully gamed that commission process. It was not a straight up partisan gerrymander. In fact, in California, the commission is technically prohibited from taking into consideration partisan data or where incumbents live. Nonetheless, Democrats, were able to win an even greater number of seats this last go round. And so I wonder whether there is now more of a bipartisan appetite heading into 2030. And what would a more Republican driven redistricting reform look like? That's something that I've been thinking about. Obviously, conservatives would like to limit the role of race in redistricting. And one aspect that I would like to investigate to see if it has more potential to get backing from different parties is moving towards something called a shortest split line algorithm, which would essentially take a state and use an algorithm to determine how to divide the state into equally populous districts using the shortest line possible while still respecting county and other jurisdiction boundaries. And so that's one area of investigation for my research.
Correct me, tell me that I'm wrong. And you say, well, what do you think? That at the core, there are two fundamental goals of redistricting that I think are at odds with each other. There are keep communities, keep the districts looking nice, keep communities and cities, communities of interest together, cities together, and competitiveness. And to me, those are fundamentally opposed because people have sorted themselves into like-minded communities. If you want competitive, evenly divided from a partisan perspective, if you want those districts, you're going to have to divide up Democratic communities and put them in with Republican communities, and you're going to have to divide them up. So I think these two goals are at odds with each other. Am I wrong?
In some cases, you're right, but in others, I do think there would be more competitive maps if communities of interest were preserved. Take Texas, for example. I'm not suggesting Texas is about to adopt a sweeping redistricting reform. It's probably the last place it will happen. However, a map that preserved some basic shapes in that state would, I think, result in a few more competitive districts than currently exist. And the same would be true in places like North Carolina or Illinois. And I do believe that there would be more incentive for the parties in Congress to work together if there were more competitive districts, because the places where you're most likely to see members of Congress go against their own party or try and appeal across the aisle are the places where they need to win a broader cross section of voters. And so even if we moved up from the 30 or 35 districts that the parties routinely spend money on to 50 or 60 districts that were genuinely in play or close to the toss-up column, I think that would make a difference in how Congress functions.
And how important do you think the focus? I feel like there's a lot of focus on the split in the congressional delegation relative to its presidential outcome. How important do you think that is as an assessment of the value or how good redistricting is in that state? Or I guess I'm leading the witness a bit. I think that can vary. The split in the delegation can vary a bit depending on what type of cycle you have during the decade. So how much do you focus on that delegation split?
Well, I think we always need to judge where these splits are relative to what split would emanate from a map that was drawn, in a random or partisan blind way, right? Because Republicans can complain all day long about a 9-0 split out of Massachusetts favoring Democrats, but it's it's fairly difficult to draw a winnable district anywhere in Massachusetts for a Republican. So a lot of this depends on each state's unique geography, and that's why it's so hard to disentangle the state's geographical realities and the distributions of voters from the map maker's intent to maximize their advantage.
So, Dave, what did we miss in this conversation about redistricting?
Not too much, but there are a number of states that will be in perpetual litigation. One of them is Texas, where most of the growth over the last couple decades has been among non-white citizens and residents. In fact, close to 95% of the growth in the last decade was among non-white residents, and yet there aren't more opportunity districts for voters of color than there were previously, and so a number of advocacy groups are suing there. But this lawsuit is finally going to be argued. But one of the reasons it's been delayed so long is that there were fights over what evidence could be discoverable. And a federal judge ruled in 2023 that Republicans could assert legislative privilege, shielding a lot of the documents from the map drawing process, which makes it harder for the plaintiffs in this case to prove that maps were drawn with any kind of discriminatory intent. So I feel like part of the goal whenever you have these long-running legal battles is for the prevailing, or whichever party prevailed in the most recent round, to simply delay or run out the clock. And that's why so many of these maps remain in place for so long, even though they're under assault from people who don't like them.
Yeah, redistricting is clearly not just something that is a story every 10 years. It's going to be a part of what we get to do for perpetually. So thank you, Dave. Please stick around so we can do this final segment. And now it's time for our final segment, Look What I Found, where we talk about anything new that we've been into: music, TV, movies, food. It could be anything. It's usually not political. Jacob, what did you find?
So I read an incredibly moving book that I had been hoping to get my hands on for a little while. It was very popular at the library, so it took a little bit of time for me to get it. It's called All the Beauty in the World. It's by Patrick Bringley, and it is a kind of a memoir and exploration of life and art taken from his 10 years as a security guard at the Met, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Patrick was he worked for the New Yorker. He was a fact checker for the New Yorker before his older brother died, and he decided to kind of turn his life upside down a little bit. He, on a whim, joined the security guard corps at the Met and ended up staying there for a decade. It's an incredibly beautifully written book. I love the Met, but it just kind of made me think about the museum in a completely different way. And I can't wait to go back to New York and explore kind of with that new frame of mind. But it's a really touching book, and I shout out to the DC Library for having it. As always, listeners know I'm their biggest fan, but I really enjoyed it, and it was a nice break from the brutality of the news cycle.
We need those palate cleansers.
Yes.
Well, even more frequently, it feels like lately. Dave, what did you find?
So it's more of an activity, and I've got 2 kids under 4 years old. So I'm constantly looking for new things to do with them apart from Paw Patrol and Bluey. And so one thing that has been fun and free is I take them to a different car dealership, a new car showroom every week. And even though I schmooze the salesperson for 15 or 20 minutes, because you kind of have to, my ulterior motive is really to let them climb in and out of cool cars for an hour. And so far, my son has test driven a Subaru WRX, a Mazda Miata, a Honda CRV, and I think most recently a VW Buzz, which is one of those retro looking but electric vans, which would make a very cool road trip car if it didn't cost $72,000 MSRP. That has been the kids' favorite activity of late.
Pre-tariffs, what's that gonna? That's gonna be like $6.4 million once the tariffs are.
It's a lot of weeks of allowance.
Any listeners any listeners who own car dealerships, I'm outing myself here. So, if they're cramping your style, feel free to kick us out.
No, but that is great advice. I have not. We have a few children ourselves, and that's great. I think people should be listening, because that's a particularly inexpensive activity. There are lots of things that cost a lot more money than that, unless you're buying the car.
Yeah, if you're not careful, it could end up being a very, very expensive activity.
True.
So I found a new band called The Pale Moonlight, based in Harrisburg. It kind of sounds like if Bonnie Tyler formed a punk band. In full disclosure, I'll admit that it is some of my friends, including one of the producers of this podcast, Conrad. He and his wife. Now, going back 25 years ago, Conrad was in a band called Goaty Hook that some of you may have listened to. But anyway, The Pale Moonlight, you should check them out. We'll put a clip to one of their songs in the chatter. They are playing at, let me make sure I get this right, on May 30th at Phantom Power in Millersville, Pennsylvania. If anyone goes to that show and talks to Conrad or Julia and mentions this podcast, I will give you a 3-month subscription to Inside Elections. So go out, support The Pale Moonlight, or at least check them out on YouTube. Subscribe to their new channel. So I'm excited.
And Nathan, I saw you responded to this tweet, but I was surprised. Maybe I'm showing my own ignorance here, that we had a listener in Austria named Klaus the Fish, who said thank you for your music recommendation 2 weeks ago, Sudden Waves, the French-Canadian pop punk band that you mentioned. So you're opening people's eyes to a whole new world of music.
I mean, if I'm their portal, then that might be don't just rely on me, but I'm happy to offer some bands that I'm finally coming around to. But it's fun. It's fun. We can't take this too seriously, right? I mean, we gotta have some fun with this. But Dave, thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure. I'm sure we'll have you back, and keep up the great work.
Well, you too, and I think the world of Inside Elections. So, thank you for having me on.
At Inside Elections, we provide nonpartisan analysis of congressional, presidential, and gubernatorial races. With a combination of reporting and data, we break down the key races and bring valuable context to complex elections. Go to InsideElections.com to subscribe to the bi-weekly newsletter. We've got individual subscriptions and group packages that are tailored for association and corporate PACs. If you liked this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and rate us on your favorite platform. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe, and leave a comment. If you didn't like today's episode, please email Larry Sabato. We also want to thank our producers, Alan Tuzinski and Melissa Lenner of Pretty Easy Podcasts, and associate producer, Conrad Tolosa. Please come back and join us again next time.